I'd like to start by asking you a question. Why are you here tonight? Why have you chosen to spend your evening listening to teens read aloud anything from poetry to children's books? And on that note, why are the teens themselves here? I'll tell you why. Because we are united by our love and appreciation for both the written and spoken word. But have you ever wondered how we've arrived at this point? How literature has evolved to become what it is today? Allow me to tell you a little bit about the very beginnings of literary texts. I'll start with a bit of background, first generally, then specifically looking at France. I will then explain some of the different genres that appeared during this era in chronological order, and will finish with a conclusion. So, background. The United States is a relatively new country. The Antiquity and the Middle Ages looked quite different here compared to developments in Europe. Its history begins in the 15th century, and it does not directly see the impact of these eras, leading people to mistake the Middle Ages in Europe for the Dark Ages, a time good only for bloodshed, brutishness, famine, forced religion. In reality, though, this was not at all reflective of the age, which, though undeniably marked with bloodshed and brutishness, also saw the economic, political, and cultural advancement of society. Architecture and international trade developed, as did agriculture. Technology saw its own improvements through the invention of gunpowder, mechanical clocks, the printing press. Perhaps as importantly, though, culture, and especially literature, started to develop. More people became literate, and storytelling slowly became story writing, popularized by the dissemination of texts thanks to the printing press. People started experimenting with language, see what they could create. And, well, it provided the basis for everything that came after in European and later American literature. So, let me tell you about the development of literature in Middle Age France as a way of nurturing appreciation for the foundations of world literature as we know it. In France specifically, it was between the 9th and 14th centuries that literature started to truly develop. In those days, borders as we now know them did not exist. Western Europe was but a series of regionally based kingdoms no longer united under the Roman Empire, which had fallen 400 years prior. The Latin language had all but died out, used only for religious purposes. And Roman languages were developing, and what is now modern France was divided into two, the langue d'oil and the langue d'oc. The langue d'oil was spoken in the north, where the original Gaulish, the Celtic language, had been greatly affected by both Latin and later Germanic invasions. The langue d'oc, by comparison, came from a much more stable, cultured, and Latin south, and was therefore far less subject to change. So now, let's look at the earliest of French literature. At that time, most texts, being religious, continued to be in Latin, and so very difficult of access for the majority of people. The first found instance of a text written in one of these early forms of French was the Serment de Strasbourg, written in 842. This records an oath between Charles the Bald and Louis the German, who make a military alliance against their older brother, Lothair I. Indeed, sibling relationships in those days were somewhat similar to more modern ones, what with the rivalry between children. Contrary to today, though, these rivalries often ended in warfare and death. But regardless, what is fascinating about this pact is that each brother pronounced it in the other's language as a way of affirming their collective peace. So this major development was the choice of language, one that might be, contrary to Latin, accessible to all. Only 40 years later came the first text that is widely recognized by scholars as being literary, the Cantilène de Sainte-Eulalie, or Canticle of Saint Eulalia. This was the first to have elements of figurative language and a clear attempt at using language in an aesthetically pleasing manner. It tells the story of Saint Eulalia, a saint and martyr. Following these first steps came longer texts and more diverse ones as authors discovered their craft. Before 1200, the great majority of French literature was composed solely as verse and then transmitted orally to a public, usually in the form of a song. Indeed, minstrels would travel from one court to another, putting on shows with instruments and performers. Is it any wonder then that chansons de geste, literally songs of deeds, became popular? These were epic poems detailing the heroic acts of various knights, the ancestors of superhero movies, if you will, and often mixed historical truth with exaggeration and fantasy. The earliest of these is the Chanson de Roland, or Song of Roland, which dates from 1100, but there is no way to know for sure that this was actually the first one. As a matter of fact, these tales are most likely very common in this era, but only about 80 written manuscripts have survived to this day. Over time, these once popular chansons de geste were replaced by the romans, which start to resemble more modern novels, but are still written in verse. Contrary to songs of deeds, these dealt with stories relating to antiquity, ranging from Alexander the Great to Troy to Celtic folklore. Long gone were the times of Christian miracles, and as such, these treated much more approachable subjects, notably courtly love. Authors such as Chrétien de Troyes helped to popularize Arthurian legend, writing all about the knights of the Round Table, such as the very fearsome Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart. It was even from one of these texts that the fake death trope popularized by Romeo and Juliet was originally used. It's quite clear that by this point, different genres were starting to emerge and slowly come in and out of popularity. Now, we agree, the Middle Ages was not a particularly fun time to live through. Warfare, malnutrition, and sickness were rampant. And so, people, as people do, turned to a new style, comedy, to cope. Satire in the form of fabliaux, or comedic short stories, were very popular. For the first time, this was literature that wasn't by and about kings and lords, but by and for the people. They made fun of the clergy's avarice and hypocrisy, the corruption of lawyers and doctors, and other such subjects by means of wordplay and elaborate deceptions and counter-deceptions. They were a form of political criticism that would eventually lead other authors and later philosophers to go further in criticism of the social order. Now come the final stages of these early days of literature. For it is important to remember that all of this was written in verse. Prose wasn't popularized until the very end of the Middle Ages. When it was, though, it led to a flourishing of all of these previous styles, from Arthurian legend and epic exploits to comedy and satire. But this time, all in prose. The first French novel was written in 1456, and it detailed a relationship in which both the hero and the heroine sought to exploit the social game of courtly love to achieve their own ends. It was this abundant exploration of language that occurred during the Middle Ages that set the scene for more complex literature to come during the Renaissance, and later, the birth of such authors as Victor Hugo and Émile Zola, and many more. We may often overlook the Middle Ages as being centuries good only for violence and religion, but in reality, it is because of the dives that people made into language, writing, and art that we have grown to where we are today. By exploring language and literature, what can be achieved through writing, these early and often anonymous authors created the necessary space for written work to grow, like planting seeds into the ground. If it hadn't been for these innovations, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Baron de Montesquieu would never have written their texts, which would then never have influenced Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. The Marquis de Lafayette would never have drafted his Declaration of the Rights of Man. In the same way, the English language would be very different from what it has become in its grammar, spelling, and pronunciation. Without the trailblazers of the so-called Dark Ages, our world would be very different from what it is today. Thank you.